Here is a fact that should not be possible. In 2026, with gene sequencing, electron microscopes, and 2 centuries of evolutionary biology behind us, there is a group of fossilised creatures that scientists still cannot classify. Not its species, not its genus, not even the kingdom of life it belonged to. Picture something with no mouth, no gut, no eyes, no brain, no front end or back end that resembles any animal alive today. Now picture that same creature preserved in such extraordinary detail that researchers can count the individual ridges on its body 555 million years after it died. Since the 1940s, one explanation after another has been proposed, tested, and torn apart. Early animals. Then, not animals at all, some researchers have seriously argued this could be an entirely separate, extinct kingdom of life, one that evolved, ruled the ancient seafloor for tens of millions of years, and then vanished so completely that almost nothing alive today can be confidently called its descendant. Some scientists call it evolution's first great experiment. Others call it evolution's first great failure. As of today, nobody has definitively won that argument. And the place where it all began isn't a laboratory. It's a low, sun-blasted range of hills in the middle of the Australian outback, so remote that most Australians have never even heard its name. That name is Ediacara. If you're new here, welcome to Hidden Origins, the channel unearthing Australia's unknown, from sacred sites the public can never enter, to geological mysteries mainstream science still hasn't closed the book on. Everything you hear on this channel is fact-checked before it reaches you. If that sounds like your kind of channel, subscribe now, because the deeper we go into this particular mystery, the stranger it gets. To understand why this argument has lasted 80 years, you first need to understand where and when these fossils actually come from. The Ediacara Hills sit within the Flinders Ranges, roughly 550 kilometres north of Adelaide, in South Australia's remote far north. This is a landscape of low, folded ridges the colour of rust and dried blood, built from a rock called the Rawnsley Quartzite Course, red-brown sandstone laid down not as desert dune, but as the floor of a shallow, ancient sea. 600 million years ago, none of this existed as dry land at all. This stretch of the continent lay submerged beneath warm, tidal waters, closer in climate to a tropical lagoon than anything you'd associate with South Australia's arid interior today. Layer by layer, fine volcanic ash and silt drifted down onto that seafloor, and stretched across the top of it was something that no longer exists anywhere on Earth in quite the same way. A living, rubbery mat of microbial film, coating the mud like skin. It was on top of that mat, and sometimes within it, that an entire ecosystem of soft, complex organisms lived out their lives. And that same mat, ironically, is what made their fossilisation possible. When a storm or a sudden pulse of sediment buried these creatures under a fresh layer of ash and sand, the tough microbial film beneath them held its shape like a death mask, preserving the exact impression of whatever had been resting on it, ridge by ridge, fold by fold, for over 500 million years. This is why the fossils of Ediacara look the way they do. There is no shell here, no bone, no hard tissue of any kind, because none of these creatures possessed any. What survives is a negative impression, a shadow pressed into stone. Scientists group this entire assemblage under one name, the Ediacaran Biota, soft-bodied, largely immobile organisms that lived on the seafloor between roughly 635 and 539 million years ago, across the geological chapter now formally known as the Ediacaran Period. And what strange bodies they left behind. Dickinsonia, an oval ribbed form, quilted like a padded mattress, ranging in size from smaller than a fingernail to over a metre across. Tribrachidium, a small disc built on threefold symmetry, not 2 sides, not 4, not 5, but 3, a body plan that essentially doesn't exist among animals alive today. Spriggina, a flattened, segmented creature with a horseshoe-shaped front end that may or may not have been a head. Parvancorina, shield-shaped, anchor-shaped, its purpose still argued over. And rising above the seafloor mat, swaying fronds like Charnia, built not from muscle or shell, but from branching. Fractal structures, unlike any living plant or animal. None of them have eyes. None of them have anything resembling a mouth, in any sense we'd recognise. And every single one of them is a real, physical fossil you can go and see today. Not an artist's reconstruction, not a theory, but rock, with a body pressed into it, waiting 555 million years for someone to ask the obvious question, what exactly am I looking at? Science asked that question for the first time in 1946. But the land itself had already been known, walked, and cared for by human beings for a length of time that makes 80 years look like almost nothing. The Ediacara Hills and the wider Flinders Ranges sit on the traditional lands of the Adnyamathanha people, a name generally translated as hills people or rock people. The Adnyamathanha refer to themselves as Yura, and their connection to this country is not a matter of historical record alone. It is a living, continuing relationship stretching back tens of thousands of years long before anyone on Earth had a word for fossil, let alone Ediacaran. The Flinders Ranges are alive with story in Adnyamathanha culture. Icara known to outsiders as Wilpena Pound, the vast natural amphitheatre that dominates the region, takes its name from the Adnyamathanha word for meeting place. It remains a site of deep significance, connected to the dreaming journey of Yulu, the old kingfisher ancestor, a story still carried and shared by Adnyamathanha elders today. Other sites throughout this country remain restricted, their fuller stories held and protected within the community rather than made public. A reminder worth sitting with that not everything about this land is, or should be, available for outsiders to know. And here is where the story turns genuinely remarkable. The name science now uses for an entire chapter of Earth's biological history, Ediacaran, applied to a geological period, a class of ancient life, and a place cited in scientific journals on every continent, did not come from a laboratory. It comes directly from the local Aboriginal word for the area, generally translated as spring of water. A term that once simply named a place where water could be found in a dry landscape has become, without most of the world ever realising it, the official name for the first great chapter of complex life on Earth. There is no record of the Adnyamathanha people knowing, in any literal sense, that the red stone of their country held the pressed bodies of 500-million-year-old organisms. How could anyone know that, without the tools of modern geology? But there is something worth pausing on in the fact that for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation walked, camped, held ceremony, and quarried ochre across this exact landscape, treating it as significant, as storied, as worthy of protection and respect, long before a single scientist arrived to explain why. That relationship has not ended. It has simply entered a new chapter. The Adnyamathanha people remain the recognised traditional owners and custodians of this country, and their consent and cultural knowledge are formally embedded in the process now underway to have the Flinders Ranges Ediacara Hills inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a decision expected as early as 2027. The ancient and the scientific, in other words, are not separate stories here. They are the same story, told in two different languages, about the same red hills. From the moment these fossils were found, this became a story of disbelief, rejection, and slow, grudging acceptance, one that unfolds like a genuine investigation, each new piece of evidence deepening the puzzle rather than resolving it. 1946, Reg Sprigg, a young geologist working for the South Australian government, is sent to inspect old, abandoned mining leases near the Ediacara minefield in the Flinders Ranges routine, unglamorous field work. Walking a hillside of weathered sandstone, He notices strange flattened impressions across dozens of loose slabs patterns that look disturbingly organic. He suspects fossils and initially dates them to the early Cambrian period, old, but not yet the almost impossible age they will later prove to be. Sprigg publishes his findings in the Transactions of the Royal Society of South Australia over the following years, but the wider international scientific community is deeply reluctant to take the discovery seriously. At the time, it is close to an article of faith in geology that complex. Multicellular life simply cannot exist in rocks this old. Sprigg's soft-bodied jellyfish impressions are dismissed in some circles as pseudofossils, meaningless patterns left by inorganic processes, mistaken for life. For the better part of a decade, the discovery is largely ignored outside South Australia. Then, in 1957, half a world away in Charnwood Forest, England, a schoolboy named Roger Mason is out walking with friends and spots a strange frond-shaped impression in a rock face. It is later named Charnia, after the forest where it was found, and crucially, it comes from rock that is unambiguously, unarguably older than the Cambrian. Suddenly, Sprigg's dismissed Australian pseudofossils look a great deal less like accidents, and a great deal more like the first known specimens of an entire missing chapter of life on Earth. Over the following years, Professor Martin Gleisner at the University of Adelaide takes up the Ediacara fossils, in earnest formally studying, naming and classifying dozens of the strange forms, Tribrachidium and Parvancorina among them, and establishing, beyond reasonable doubt, that these creatures predate the Cambrian explosion. What had been ridiculed becomes one of the most important paleontological discoveries of the 20th century. By 2004, the fossils are considered significant enough that an entire new chapter is added to the official geological timescale of Earth, the Ediacaran Period, its formal starting point defined using rock exposed at Inarama Creek, roughly 55 kilometres away in that same stretch of the Flinders Ranges. It is the first new geological period added to that timescale in over 120 years. But naming a period is not the same as solving its central mystery. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, German paleontologist Adolf Seilacher throws the field into fresh disarray, arguing that most of these organisms are not early animals at all, but members of a completely separate, extinct kingdom of life he names the Vendobionta quilted, air mattress-like structures that might not even be truly multicellular in the way we understand it. His challenge is taken seriously enough to trigger over a decade of genuine scientific reassessment. Was Sprigg's jellyfish actually an animal? By the 1990s, nobody can say for certain. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough finally cracks open one small piece of the puzzle, though not the whole thing. On a remote wind-battered cliff on the White Sea coast of Russia, researcher Ilya Bobrovsky, working with Associate Professor Jochen Brox of the Australian National University, recovers a Dickinsonia fossil so exceptionally preserved that traces of its original organic tissue survive within the rock. Chemical analysis reveals molecules of cholesterol, a fat produced only by animal cells locked inside the fossil, and specifically rules out fungal or algal explanations for this specimen. After more than 70 years of argument, science finally has direct, molecular proof at least one member of the Ediacaran biota really was an animal. It should have ended the debate. It didn't, not entirely. Within weeks, other researchers publicly challenged parts of the analysis in the scientific literature, and the wider question remains stubbornly open. Dickinsonia may now be settled, more or less. But Tribrachidium, Parvancorina, Charnia, and dozens of other genera from that same ancient seafloor still carry no such proof. As of today, most of the residents of Ediacara remain exactly what they were in 1946, unidentified. So if part of you is waiting for this to take a supernatural turn, for someone to suggest these creatures were something otherworldly, something science genuinely cannot explain, keep watching. Because what serious researchers have actually proposed, investigated, and had to rule out is stranger and far more scientifically interesting than any ghost story. Subscribe now, because we're about to get into exactly what that investigation found. Any fossil this strange, this old, and this resistant to easy explanation tends to attract more than serious science. Search online today and you'll find no shortage of amateur theories about the Ediacaran Biota, that these creatures represent an entirely separate genetic origin of life on Earth, a second genesis unrelated to everything alive today, that they're bizarre. Symmetry-defying bodies are evidence of extraterrestrial biology, but mainstream paleontology is quietly sitting on how anomalous these fossils truly are. It's worth being direct here, none of that holds up. Every documented Ediacaran fossil is built from ordinary carbon-based biochemistry, embedded in ordinary sedimentary rock, dated using well-established, independently repeatable methods. Nothing recovered from these fossils differs in any fundamental way from life as we understand it. The second genesis framing makes for a dramatic headline. It is not where the actual evidence leads. What is true, and frankly stranger than any alien theory, is the sheer scale of the genuine, unresolved scientific disagreement underneath all that sensationalism. That disagreement has a real name and a real history. The fight over whether the Ediacaran biota belongs inside the animal kingdom at all, or whether it represents Adolf Seilacher's proposed Vendobionta, a separate, extinct kingdom entirely. Seilacher's argument was never fringe pseudoscience. It was published, peer-reviewed, seriously engaged with paleontology. Built on a genuine anatomical puzzle, many Ediacaran fossils show a quilted structure tube-like segments stitched together like an air mattress, with no visible evidence of a mouth, a gut, or any conventional means of feeding. If they couldn't eat the way animals do, Seilacher reasoned, perhaps they weren't animals at all. Perhaps they survived through some form of symbiosis with photosynthetic or chemical processing microorganisms, more like a coral and algae partnership, or something closer to lichen. That last idea was pushed further still by geologist Gregory Retalak, who controversially argued that many Ediacaran fossils weren't marine organisms at all, but land-dwelling, lichen-like colonies, a theory that would upend not just their identity, but the entire ancient environment they're assumed to have lived in. His work faced substantial pushback from the wider paleontological community and the weight of geological evidence tidal sediment structures. Marine mineral signatures, and later the 2018 biomarker study itself, which specifically ruled out fungal affinities, sits heavily against it. But Redlak's papers forced the field to rigorously retest assumptions it had, in places, simply been accepting. This is what real scientific investigation of a genuine mystery actually looks like. Not a cover-up, not a conspiracy, but decades of researchers proposing testable ideas, publishing them, and picking apart each other's evidence in academic journals until something solid survives the process. The 2018 cholesterol discovery in Dickinsonia is the clearest product of exactly that process. Hard biochemical evidence that finally, for one genus at least, settled an argument speculation alone never could. So no, these are not aliens, and there is no cover-up. But the honest, fully investigated scientific answer turns out to be almost as unsettling as the myth it replaces. Because it means an entire, thriving kingdom-level branch of life may have evolved once, ruled the seafloor for tens of millions of years, and vanished and modern science, even now, still cannot fully say what most of it actually was. Here is the reality, stripped of embellishment. And it does not need a single supernatural detail to be genuinely unsettling. For roughly 40 million years, the Ediacaran biota did not just exist, it dominated. Across ancient seafloors on nearly every continent, from the Flinders Ranges to the White Sea coast of Russia, from Newfoundland to Namibia, this strange assemblage of quilted, frond-like, three-armed, mouthless organisms was, for a time, the most complex form of life anywhere on Earth. This was not a minor evolutionary side branch. For tens of millions of years, it was the entire visible frontier of biological complexity on this planet. And then, within a relatively narrow window at the end of the Ediacaran period, it was almost entirely erased. The leading scientific explanation involves no meteor, no plague, no single dramatic catastrophe, though some researchers argue that a major environmental shock, a violent disruption to Earth's carbon cycle, played a role. The other equally compelling explanation is quieter, and in some ways more unsettling, the rise of a genuinely new kind of animal behaviour. In the final few million years of the Ediacaran, some organisms began doing something this peaceful seafloor world had never really had to contend with. They began burrowing into the sediment, and they began eating other living things. Scientists call this shift the substrate revolution. For the Ediacaran biota, most of which depended on living directly atop a stable, unbroken mat of microbial film coating the seafloor, this was catastrophic in the most literal sense. Burrowing animals churned up and destroyed that mat, breaking apart the very ground this entire ecosystem needed to survive. Add the arrival of active predators, the first creatures on Earth, systematically consuming other complex organisms, and an ecosystem that had ruled the ocean floor for tens of millions of years simply had no answer. It did not adapt. It disappeared. This is, by some measures, the first true mass extinction of complex life in Earth's history, a preview, in miniature, of every extinction event that would follow, including the one currently unfolding around us today. And it happened not because something malevolent arrived, but because life itself changed the rules of the game permanently, and an entire kingdom of organisms could not keep pace. It is, in its own way, the grounded version of exactly what the Adnyamathanha understood about this landscape long before any of this was known, that this country carries enormous weight. Not the weight of a curse, and not a warning to stay away, but the weight of significance, of story, of something vast having happened here that deserves to be treated with seriousness and respect. Science has simply given that weight a name, a date, and a mechanism. 539 million years ago, in the mud beneath what is now a quiet range of red hills in South Australia, an entire world ended. And to this day, we are still identifying the bodies. 80 years ago, Reg Sprigg looked down at a slab of red sandstone and saw the impossible, proof that something complex had lived on Earth before anyone believed complex life could exist at all. Today, scientists have identified dozens of species, named an entire geological period after this landscape, and finally proven, for at least one of these strange beings, that it truly was an animal. And still, for most of the ancient residents of Ediacara, the fundamental question remains wide open. Maybe that's the real lesson of this place, that the oldest and deepest mysteries are rarely solved all at once. They are solved slowly, respectfully, one fossil, one culture's knowledge, and one stubborn question at a time, much as the Adnyamathanha people have understood this country for tens of thousands of years, and science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. So what do you think these creatures actually were? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more of Australia's deepest, strangest, and best researched mysteries, subscribe to Hidden Origins. There's a lot more still buried.